Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday night. It's 7 p. No, it's Monday night. Okay. Great start, Helms. I feel like, okay, a little peek behind the curtain. Starting out, we always did these on Wednesday nights. We changed it because someone, me, was being difficult. But I kind of have this like built-in, it's like a physiological response now. It's like lights, camera, action. You hit start and you say, hey, everybody, it's Wednesday night. So my apologies. Some of you will listen to this on a Wednesday. So, probably about 14% of the time, I'm going to be relatively correct here. But it's actually Monday night. It's 7 p.m. Eastern time. That's when we do these live on YouTube. I'm Eric Trexler. I'm here with the good Dr. Eric Helms. And Helms, I am worried about you, if I could be candid. So you showed up to record tonight. Generally speaking, I refrain from commenting on your appearance. That's just a professional thing that I do. Good or bad, I leave it alone. But you showed up with some bruising around your eyes. And I asked, as a caring person, did you get in some kind of a scuffle? Was there an argument over who was doing too many sets in the squat rack? You told me that's not the case. You said it was leaky blood vessels. And then I asked about your travel history, because that does sound like Ebola. So why don't you tell the good people what you've been up to and whether or not you're okay?
Well, what I've been up to is training 9 times a week. And for those who think that's absolutely insane, hi, my name is Eric Helms. And the reason I'm training 9 times a week is because I've actually just been splitting up my volume a bit more and experimenting with that. What that results in, though, is even though it's the same total amount of work as when I only had 5 training sessions with a couple of real marathon sessions, I'm essentially now having no days off of massive Valsalva-induced increases in blood pressure. And I've been noticing that I've been getting a little more like burst blood vessels in certain portions of my face or sometimes even on my chest. Having been in the powerlifting game a long time and from being around since pre-raw era, this is something I have actually seen a lot in some of my friends and colleagues, especially equipped lifters, that they get bruises on their chest, their pecs, their shoulders, or even on their face, which if you search bruises on face after training, Reddit or powerlifting, you'll see a ton of people, but most of them are probably like super heavy, people much stronger than me wearing a squat suit. And for me, it's just hold breath on a leg press, an RDL, or a good morning basically every other day. So I think that's what it is, because I noticed now that I'm hitting some good PRs though, Trex, I'm telling you. Like, I will look like I'm getting beat up every day if this keeps happening. I got a set of 6 on 180 kilos in RDLs at a submaximal RPE. I got 320 kilos for 10 on leg press, and I don't know what the sled weighs. That's just 8 20-kilo plates aside. These are huge lifetime PRs. So I will take literally being beat down my training if it results in those type of PRs.
Yeah. So to be honest, when it comes to like rupturing blood vessels while lifting, obviously I'm aware of, what we used to see all the time with people who were doing, equipped powerlifting back when there were no real like tested federations, right? They were super heavyweight. So like, I think part of my bias was I was just assuming that these folks, if you randomly tested them, had blood pressure of like 210 over 140 at any given time. So I think to me, it was just kind of jarring to see, an esteemed colleague of mine who I presume, has a cardiovascular system that is not literally bursting at the seams 24/7 due to steroid use and a BMI of 45, and then putting 900 pounds on your back with wrapped knees in a squat suit. It was a little concerning to me, but I am glad to hear that apparently this is just part of the deal.
No, my blood work is good to go. My resting heart rate at night, according to my Fitbit, which as we know is the most
gold
accurate
standard
thing. Yeah, gold standard, is like between 35 and 40. So I would be...
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty low. In fact, maybe I'm in a status of low energy availability, and this is a new symptom that we just don't even know about.
Oh, we know about that one.
This like
Oh,
bruising around the eyes.
I thought you were talking about your heart rate. I was like, what are you talking about? Yeah.
No. I'm saying my heart rate is reflective of low energy availability, unless there's another spoke on that wheel that I was unaware of, like poor vascular compliance, or maybe I'm just eating too much salmon and fish oil. Maybe I'm just like, I've been like flooded with Coumadin equivalent and I'm just bleeding everywhere. And all it takes is a little bit of pressure and it just perfuses. I don't know.
Yeah, this doesn't look like mercury poisoning, so I don't think you've done that again. But yeah, we'll figure it out.
You weren't supposed to remember that.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't want to poke fun. I actually, my blood pressure is becoming a problem. I've been like hanging out in like kind of high blood pressure. May or may not be why I've had such an interest in writing more health-oriented mass articles over the years. But anyway, yes, I'm not poking fun at my brethren who would prefer to have their blood pressure in a slightly better range. Don't worry about me, folks. I'll be okay. But I'm not like a biohacker, but when things start getting a little bit out of the normal range that you're shooting for, that's when I say, okay, I better nip this in the bud, right? So my systolic's not like hanging out at 200 all day, but nonetheless, been doing more walking. Someone alerted me to vegetables. A lot of them grow out of the ground, trees, whatever.
Yeah.
So I've been
most of the time. Sometimes
a lot of green ones, orange, yellow, whatever. So I've been trying to get some of that going. But Helms, enough about us. I know a lot of people come here just for that, but a lot of people come here for a lot of college football analysis. And in my no, you can't have that visceral reaction because we had a question in the chat. So that means this is me doing my job. But more importantly, and more to the point, the question was, how if we had any analysis coming up for the NFL Combine, which I believe should be happening soon. And Helms, you've been on record saying that is the only part of football that you have or ever will care about. So I don't have any stats to throw around yet, but it was a great thing to bring up in the chat. I had no idea it was happening. The college and NFL annual calendar has just been kind of like sprawling out as this like giant nonstop 12-month thing. So I had no idea that the Combine was coming up, if it is. But we will have to look up some crazy stats and make some projections for what we expect. Because there's always going to be some freak who just rolls in there and does 42 reps on the bench press with 225. Just absolutely insane athletes. Or, a guy who weighs 320 pounds who's going to go out and run like a 4.840. Just absolutely insane athletes. So we will cover that in a very narrow window. Helms, that you agreed to this contractually. It'll be fun. People will like it. But I don't have any stats up today. Okay,
I got one.
So you're safe. Okay, what do you got?
So, I'll ask you a question. How long do you think the current bench press record for the 225 for reps has stood?
I feel like you wouldn't ask this if it wasn't a surprise. Like normally I would say like 1 to 3 years, but I'm going to think maybe someone like Larry Allen just went nuts like 35 years ago.
Yeah, you're pretty close there. It was actually a little known player, Justin Ernest, in 1999. He was a defensive tackle at Eastern Kentucky. He was named, you'll like this, All-Ohio Valley Conference in 1997. 6'3", 281 pounds, and that's actually kind of small for an NFL tackle, even in the 90s. And here's my question for you. What do you think was the number of reps he got on bench press?
I'm going to guess 48.
Real close. 51 reps.
Okay.
Isn't that insane?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm liking my guesses tonight. I'm feeling I'm getting
point
there. But yeah, the bench press is one of those things where there's like, that's the thing about it is you run into the guy in the gym with a BMI of 40 who's like, just so you know, I used to do, 35 plus reps with 225. And it's like 99 out of 100 are lying. But there is that one dude from Ohio that like was actually doing that. And it's so hard to tell. But yeah, that's crazy, man. So we're going to get all the stats whenever that happens. And I assume it's coming up if we're getting asked about it. But yeah, I remember, though, this is one of the things I always lean back on. I actually helped out with some combine prep many years ago. with Rob Wildman. He was down at Chip Smith's facility down there in Atlanta. And it was one of those facilities where people come to do their combine prep from all over the place. And it was really cool. Rob Wildman is a big sport nutrition guy, so we were helping out with some of the sport nutrition stuff. And it was such an eye-opening experience because I just know from being in the industry, you take a random person who's like in evidence-based fitness, walk them through there and say, how many of these guys are on steroids? And they would say, actually, that's a trick question. They are all on steroids. Look at these specimens, just their size, power, strength, physiques. And it just blows your mind when you actually talk to some of these people who have unreal genetics and exercise all day, even if it's not perfectly optimized throughout their college career or whatever. I was talking to this one guy who looked like he could walk into any natural bodybuilding show and win by a mile. Just you walk up and say, okay, it's over. Everyone go home. He was a running back. And we were asking him, because we were doing the nutrition stuff, and this is combine prep. They're coming in and basically doing like a 9 to 5 of working out. Like it's just so much of just everything. So we're like, at the end of the day, what'd you have for breakfast? Nothing. What'd you have for lunch? Nothing. What did you snack on throughout the day? Nothing. Okay, what kind of caloric beverages did you drink throughout the day? Nothing. Okay, so you just worked out like 3 sessions between 9 and 5 p.m. You haven't touched a calorie today. What are you going to eat when you go home? I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. Like,
Probably
it is
everything.
I mean, it's like a peanut butter and jelly. Like, I don't really cook, It's just like, it's someone who's just like living out of a hotel, like living out of a suitcase and just like, what are you going to eat? I don't know. Who cares? Why do you ask? He literally seemed like it was this weird, like, what are you getting at? Why are you asking these questions? But it just it really blows your mind when you start to talk to people who are truly elite genetically, and you find that they are surpassing your wildest dreams without thinking much about it or doing anything remotely close to optimally. And so that's that was such an eye-opening experience. And I remember we published a paper a while back on college football players with their fat-free mass index, and they were high. What do you know? It turns out that in one of the biggest sports in America that is flooded with cash and invests zillions of dollars into recruiting and development, there's actually some muscular guys there. And everyone was like, yeah, they're all on steroids. This research is trash. And after that combine prep, I was like, you fundamentally have no idea who we're talking about here. But anyway, yeah, football is, if nothing else, Helms, it's great for just the absolute unbelievable athletes who are just so strong and powerful. No human has any business being that big or strong. All right, Helms, let's get into the science here.
Let's do it.
We've tiptoed around some science. We mentioned fat-free mass index, so that counts. But we have quite an issue of mass coming up.
I do.
Short month. So that'll be published in under a week. It'll be published by the 1st of March, probably the day before. And in that issue, you had an article, which I enjoyed. And the reason I liked it was it touched on a topic that I can't get enough of. I've had to recuse myself from writing articles about this in mass because everyone kind of said, hey, Eric, enough is enough. We got to cool off, have some variety in our offerings. But you decided to write about lengthened partials this month.
Long muscle length training.
Okay, sorry. Long muscle length training. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it and why everyone on the internet is wrong?
I would love to. So 2 ironic statements that you made and probably didn't realize it. One is that you said this is an article that you can't stop writing about, or a topic that you can't start writing about, so you recused yourself. That's sort of true, because while the article is disguised as one on lengthened-biased training, it's actually an article mostly about sampling variance. So, and you did just write probably more than you ever want to write about on stats and mass.
Yeah,
you put
I'm
out
done.
2 guides. Yeah.
Yeah, I've retired.
Absolutely. The other ironic thing is that just as much as, when we're not being tongue-in-cheek, just as much as I dislike college football. I know you don't like talking about lengthened bias training. And you said, hey, I have to talk about this. I'm obligated to. There is a comment in the chat. You know what the first comment in the Iron Culture live chat was before we even kicked off the episode? Recent studies seem to often find trained lifters don't see extra benefit from lengthened bias training like beginners. Do the effects diminish as training age increases, or are there other causes? So,
intriguing.
I posed the article I wrote that is coming out on the March 1st issue of Mass as a from the mailbag. So some people might think that I just make up these questions and write about whatever I want and pretend that people out there are asking me questions, but I've got the proof right here. And indeed, it is very true that over the last...
you got the proof that came after the fact, which is a little dubious in a court of law.
But... No. It was there before you told me to say this, and I'm sure there is some way...
No, I mean, you wrote the article like 3 weeks ago, so...
Yeah, but in the article, I was saying, hey, people are asking this, and here people are still asking this, and it's not a plant.
Yeah, it's a continuation.
Okay? Correct. It is a continuing trend that I am still trying to address, probably because the article I wrote that addresses it hasn't come out yet, to your point. But nonetheless, Trex, what I'm getting at is that actually, over the last, I would say 3, 4, or 5 months, there has been this kind of whiplash effect for people following this area of research. There's a lot coming out on the broader topic of quote-unquote lengthened bias training. And if you felt like there was a lot coming out in 2023, and there was, it's even more now. So in the last 3 months alone, there has been 4 published papers, that's just since December, that are on some aspect of lengthened bias training. And I'm aware of another 4 papers that are actually preprints that have come out either in 2024 or 2025 that have not even yet gone through peer review. And the shocking part, Trex, is that unlike kind of where our heads were at in 2023, where it's like, oh, it's clearly, a mostly positive effect. We've got that one study that Wolf did where it didn't work on the arms for trained people. And that's not hamstring curls of different types or putting your arm over your head to get more long head, effect, or leaning back in the leg extension. That's just lengthened partials, which, to be clear, different types of lengthened bias training should not be conflated. But in this broad umbrella area, most of it was positive. But in these 8 ones that have come out in the last 3 months, or that haven't even come out yet, they're still preprints, 5 out of 3 actually had null findings. Ooh. And yeah, I think to summarize the general response in the evidence-based community to seeing this online, the sky is falling would be maybe a general response. I don't know who I am anymore, or if we're in a simulation, or if people had a bias, haha, I told you so. You are both somehow simultaneously trying to cook the books as well as proving yourself wrong and an idiot. And I choose both simultaneously, even though that's not possible. Yes, Trex.
The phrase that came to mind for me is nail in the coffin.
Nail in the coffin, yes, sir. Which is something you should really avoid ever saying as a researcher or someone who follows science-based content.
Except Louise Burke had an excellent article, is the nail in the coffin of low-carb diets for endurance athletes. That one stood the test of time. Yeah.
Question mark, though. So see.
Well, if you read the full text, there weren't a lot of questions asked.
Well, she does answer her own question, just as we do with our article titles in Mass.
And by the way, I love Louise Burke. I love that article. It is fantastic.
She was actually one of my 2 master's thesis examiners.
So wow, look at you.
And to be clear, I still have my master's, and she's a critical thinker. Let's just put it that way. So I did all right. Yeah. So to answer both the question from Killer Katibi 009, as well as a bunch of different ones I got via DM, and I've had in person even for someone at the gym over the last several months, it is true that a majority of studies as of late that have come out have found null results when looking at various aspects of lengthened bias training. And it's not even just in trained lifters. It's been shown in some untrained lifters as well. Now, I was reflecting on this, Trex, and I was thinking about how we did the whole science communication thing circa 2010, when meta-analyses were few and far between and probably done only about 70% right. And the typical way that we would have a science communicator gauge things, and I would say more in the, I'm going to try to help generally you get leaner and bigger, and I'm bodybuilding adjacent, but I'm not talking to a competitive bodybuilder, was to kind of take the tact of, unless it clearly works, it doesn't, or it doesn't matter. This is kind of your nutrient timing take. This is your high protein take. This is your take on most supplements. And absolutely, if you're a general fitness person, absolutely, that's the way you should view some of these things. And it was gauged by, hey, we got like 6 studies. 1 found a positive effect. 1 was unclear. 4 were null. Nothing's probably going on here. And it really depends on what your definition of nothing is. I think what we've come to learn more recently, because when we are doing sports nutrition and sports science, we are almost by definition, except with some notable exceptions, which I'll discuss, we're doing low sample size research, and we're typically, in the modern era, trying to find small, trivial, or not very large moderate effects. So smallish to moderate. Trivial to moderate, I would say, describes the majority, with most of them sitting closer to small. And depending upon the paradigm we're using and the individual lab, there may or may not be very good measurement consistency, or the measurement error might be larger than the effect we're even trying to look at. So what that means is that any given individual study is not a great gauge of our ability to actually measure a true effect. And there's a big difference between a null effect and a negative effect that goes the other way. And one thing you can say about the lengthened-biased training is I have yet to see any study that goes, oh, look at that. Shortened-biased training was actually better than full range of motion or lengthened-biased training. Hasn't happened yet. And despite that, people are starting to kind of flip back and forth. And I think it's because of that kind of old school science communication, pre-meta science, really good statistical understanding kind of vote counting method of gauging whether something is worthwhile. And I think if we're talking about lengthened-biased training, if we're talking about maximizing your rectus femoris hypertrophy, or making sure that your short head of your hamstrings or your long head of your triceps is growing, my assumption is that you're a psycho like me and you care about maximizing everything. So my assumption is I'm not just telling someone who's like, hey, I'm thinking about getting into lifting. So how do I get my rectus femoris to grow? If that's probably not where your head's at, if you're still in the information gathering stage of which gym membership should I get, right? So if you're someone who cares about this stuff, I think you would probably care about small effects. And that means we have to think about what should we expect. And if we're expecting a trivial to small effect, and if we're looking at small sample size studies in most cases, then we have to think, well, how often are they actually going to be significant? And when they are significant, how often are they going to be representative of the actual effect size? Now, I think it's easier to talk about this in a less contentious area. Trex, I would describe both of us as people who are protein researchers. And would you agree with the premise that pretty much everybody in the at least the semi-academic space of protein, agrees that high protein diets are better for hypertrophy, with the only disagreements being what defines the word high? Okay. So this is a relatively non-contentious area. Higher protein to a point, generally better than lower protein. Here's the thing. 2022 meta-regression and analysis by Nunez and colleagues. It is the most up-to-date, largest batch of studies that includes resistance-trained individuals. If you look at resistance training in energy balance or surplus while consuming either higher or lower protein, which they used for their meta-regression of 72 study groups, only 8% of those 72 study groups, if you looked at them individually, was there a significant effect if you were to look at the confidence interval of the standardized mean difference crossing that zero of there being a positive effect of protein. That means 66 out of 72, or 92% of them, found null findings. They crossed that zero line. But we all agree high protein is better. And when you look all the way at the bottom, of that forest plot or series of forest plots, because they had their sub-analyses for the different categorical protein intakes, you see, bam, I think it's 0.19. So like straddling right on the line of what in most effect size families we call a trivial or just barely small at 0.2 effect size. And the 95% confidence interval is entirely positive. I think it's like 0.11 to 0.28 or something like that. So we have pretty high certainty that higher protein intakes generally are better. It just doesn't matter that much. And I would ask everyone to consider that if we're talking about the difference between, say, a 30-degree knee angle difference on a leg press, that maybe we should also be hunting for a trivial effect size in terms of like quadricep thickness growth over 8 weeks in trained individuals, which is what that recent study by Larson and colleagues specifically sought out to figure out. And they found, oh my God, no effect. So to give a bit of a context to people who aren't following this line of research, we've had several studies which have kind of been shocking to people, right? Lengthened partials, area of contention. And I agree there are times when I would not even expect a lengthened partial to be better than full range of motion if it's already challenging in that initial range of motion, because it's kind of already a lengthened partial, right? But if you told me, hey, a dumbbell lateral raise versus a cable lateral raise with the cable set at hip height, I would bet money, right? Or I'd put my chips on, I should say, that there's a higher probability of getting more deltoid growth in that cable lateral raise.
If you ever go to a casino, you should know the chips do represent money, just for your information.
Okay, that makes sense.
Be careful out there. Yeah.
Yeah. I've had some troubles with the bill collectors, and I keep sending them chips. They don't take it. So I understand now what happened. Okay. Well, life lessons. This is what happens when you only learn about things adjacent to bodybuilding. Okay. The other one that came out also by Larson. Larson's doing great work. And I actually think these are part of the same data collection, is they had leg press done to, I think, 100 degrees of knee flexion. So deepish, kind of parallel-ish, or as deep as that individual could go, letting the heel come up kind of, RP style, knees in the chest. No significant difference in quadricep muscle thickness specifically. That's all they looked at. And then here's also one I think is really important. James Steele was part of this. He talked about it a good bit. Multi-site intervention that had hundreds of participants, and they compared lengthened partials to normal range of motion training. And this is where you can actually start to observe very small changes. Trained individuals, and they were, one critique that you could have, but I don't think it's a valid one based upon what I'll explain, is they were using circumferences and other anthropometry to estimate changes in muscle size. And they used an equation. That does have higher error than, say, jumping into a DEXA or doing ultrasound. And that can be completely overcome if you have hundreds of people across multiple sites, which they did. Now, the one thing that I do have as a critique of this study, or more so the interpretation of its findings, is that they observed an extremely small effect of training at all. So while I agree that they are adequately powered to make what is typically an unreliable measurement sufficiently accurate to observe like really trivial changes, I don't know if we're only expecting a small difference between lengthened partials at best compared to normal training to observe that difference between groups, when at best both groups are only getting a really, really small change. So that's kind of to answer that question about trained individuals. So multiple things are compounding.
Those are the
here.
worst kinds of studies, by the way, because you kind of read through it and you say, what's the point of anything?
Yeah.
It's just like these people are turning over the smallest rocks possible looking for extra gains, and it's like the conclusion is like, no one's making gains. Grow up.
That's essentially James Steele's overall take on sports science. He is, if you want to get black-pilled, just follow James Steele. I will point out, though, that it was a very low-volume protocol. So, we're looking at, it was like 12 weeks trained individuals, and they're doing, I think 6 to 8 sets per muscle group-ish, with some of that being lengthened-biased. And I was like, this isn't if we're trying to milk out every last little bit, we're missing some big rocks here, training more than 30 minutes a session 3 times a week. Come on. If you're doing lengthened partials and you only have an hour and a half to commit per week, maybe for a really time-restricted period, you're trying to be hyper-efficient. But I think most of the people are trying to turn over pebbles and sand, maybe train hard. I don't know.
This is like our conversation last episode,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I also want to tip the cap, even though you're the one wearing the cap, to you, because in addition to me kind of in the article and in this speech that I've just been giving, leverage the data from Nunez, which I think shows it really well. You can see, man, we know protein works, but most studies show protein doesn't work, and we need a meta-regression and a meta-analysis to demonstrate that's the case. I asked you if you could simulate basically 20 10 versus 10 comparisons of people doing quote-unquote lengthened-biased training. And, I got you some studies on different quadricep muscle thickness changes, one in untrained people, one in untrained, and got some pretty representative standard deviations, means, so we could get that pre-post effect size. I said, hey, let's assume just a barely small effect size of 0.2. We ran into a bit of a snag in that it was very difficult to figure out the pre-post test correlation, which is not often reported in sports science studies, but gives us an idea of how much heterogeneity occurs in a sample, which includes measurement error. So the good Dr. Trexler here, he gave me a range, a 0.7 correlation showing high heterogeneity, 0.8 kind of in the middle, and 0.9 showing relatively low heterogeneity. And I put those plots in the figure, as figures in the article, and it was about what I expected. So we had a simulated population of 200,000 people. And the real effect size that we knew was there, because we inputted that into R to make it the case.
I cooked the books. Yeah. You basically came to me and you said, listen, Eric, I've been selling drugs for a long time, but what would my accounting look like if instead I owned a coin-operated laundromat? And that's pretty much what we did. And so we knew precisely what the effect size was in the population, which is a privilege that we never have in research.
100%. So we money laundered our way to demonstrating something which is true if our assumptions are true, which are assumptions. But it demonstrates that, hey, if we knew for sure in a simulated data set that there was a small, barely small, straddling trivial effect in the Cohen's D family of effect sizes, or Hedges G, if you like, similar representation in terms of interpretation. There's a 0.2 effect of quote-unquote lengthened bias training compared to normal training. And then we did 20 samples of 10 by 10 comparisons. How often would we get significant results in your traditional null hypothesis testing, p less than 0.05? And then also, what would those effect sizes be? And in both the 0.7, which I presented, and the 0.9 pre-post correlation, to give like a high or low heterogeneity kind of world of sports science, if you will, only 2 or 10% of the studies actually had a significant effect. And importantly, in all 4 of the significant effects, they were inflating the effect size. Sometimes they were still in the small classification, I think on 1, maybe 2 occasions, but we're talking much closer to like 0.4 rather than 0.2, and 0.5 is traditionally where moderate is. But most of the time, to simply find significance, and this is the whole thing about statistical power, you need to observe a larger effect for a lower sample to be significant in most cases. That's kind of that inverse relationship. They were exaggerating it. And when you did see effect sizes that were representative, 0.18, 0.19, 0.21, 0.24, they were never significant. So it shows this kind of thing of, oh, wow, if 90% of the studies are actually showing me positive results that are significant, and only 10%, just like protein, roughly, are showing me null results, there might be something real going on. If there's no publication bias, like if we had a little, our funnel plot and they were all sitting within that nice little Christmas tree, that's probably the case. And of course, there are assumptions baked into what I'm saying, and I'm not saying every single time you see a whole lot of null and 1 positive, that's not the case, because it could be the file drawer effect on those negatives. But I think on something like this, where we're not seeing 10%, it's more like 50-50 at this stage if you kind of look at the overall aggregate body of literature. And some of that I do think is helped by the fact that the data are mostly within participant studies in a lot of these cases, which eliminates a lot of that heterogeneity, which I'm guessing is one of the reasons why you said, hey, let's go with the 0.9 correlation, pre-post correlation, because I think there probably isn't a tremendous amount of your typical sources of sampling variance. By the way, I should probably say what the hell sampling variance is now that I've talked about this so much. So yeah, okay. So sampling variance is simply exactly what you demonstrated with that simulation, that when you sample from a given population, there's going to be variability in the outcome. And it's not going to match what we see because there is always unexplained variance, or I should say variance unrelated to the independent and dependent variable whenever you do a study. Easy ways we can explain this, you got 10 versus 10. It's not that low of a probability that the 10 who got put into the more impactful resistance training protocol happened to more often have kids or pets who disrupted their sleep and recovery was worse. Or perhaps they just were undereaters. Or perhaps even though it was a study on quote unquote trained individuals, the ones in one group were, just a lot closer to their genetic ceiling. They trained harder, they trained more consistently. They both met the criteria cutoff, but you had a lot of people with less propensity to grow because they're already closer to their kind of genetic cap of muscle mass in one group versus the other. And you can think of a million different examples, I'm sure, and some of these even do apply within participant designs, where you're going to get outcomes that are influenced by factors unrelated to the variable you're manipulating. And I've even heard some, not fully educated on statistics people basically say, this is why I don't think science is worth it. But this gets eliminated, or I shouldn't say eliminated, it gets accounted for with a sufficient sample size. Because when you have a higher and higher sample in both groups, then the likelihood of an equal distribution of randomness increases, and you can see that signal for the noise. But that's not happening when we only have studies of 6, 7, 8 people versus another. And that is essentially what we're dealing with in 90% of cases. The only probably adequately powered study that has been published on lengthened partials is Schneider. And like I said before, they saw a trivial effect, so I don't think you could observe a difference between there anyway. So we do kind of have to take a step back, pump the brakes, and instead of always trying to dive into the methods to tease out exactly what might have went wrong, and don't get me wrong, we do this in every issue of mass. And these could be the reasons, these methodological things we find that explain why there was a difference between conditions or between groups or between limbs, but we don't know that. So I claimed that I think perhaps one of the reasons that led to very similar outcomes in both left and right arms in Wolf's lengthened partial versus full range of motion study was that there actually wasn't as much of a difference in the range of motion as intended. When you look at the participant videos, there was maybe only like a 25% difference when it should have been more at most. And they are, in both groups, were doing exercises which favored and biased long muscle lengths anyway. I don't know for sure that's why that outcome occurred. And neither does anyone else who's claiming they did this in the quads. And quads operate on this portion of the length-tension relationship and they don't respond to long muscle lengths. We don't know that. We don't actually have empirical data to show the mechanism of why there was a difference. It could have been just as likely that some aspect of sampling variance did that. So I'm not saying we shouldn't try to tease out methodological explanations for why this might have occurred, but I have heard researchers, full-time researchers, who I respect, who have said things like, there's always a reason why, some studies don't replicate. And there is. But I think the implication when I hear them say that is they think it has to do with the methods or poor control or measurement error. And in reality, I think many times it's partially that, and it's also partially sampling variance, and it may be one much more than the other. But sampling variance is always at play to some degree. And that is just the nature of it. And that's why you really shouldn't get too caught up on any individual finding. And I even think, and I hate to say it because it kind of takes away some agency from the listener, but if you want to get closer to true, I got to speak the truth, that kind of a casual following of a given area of research where you're not sure that you're actually seeing every single study that comes out and kind of just doing a back of the mind vote counting tally of, oh yeah, that was leaning positive, that was leaning negative, I'll get a general sense of this. I don't know that you will. I really don't. I think you have to be super diligent. You probably have to set up Google search alerts, and honestly, you'd probably need to throw the actual standardized mean difference or just the mean change into a spreadsheet and look at that to be close. So it just shows you how important well-done meta-science is in our field. And if you try to gauge it in another way, I think you're probably going to be misled. And one thing that also stood out to me in that 0.7, that high heterogeneity simulated world that we could all be living in, we don't know. There was one study that had a p-value of 0.077, so nearly significant, and it had a negative moderate effect. So in contrast to a positive small one, it said, hey, it was nearly significant. There was a moderate negative effect. And imagine as well that there's an equal probability of any of these 20 studies coming out at any given order or time, because that's the way probability works. So what if there had been, back in 2022 or 2021, after we had the Pedrosa study and then the Cassiano study, and then bam, this one comes out and it goes, actually, we got a negative effect from lengthened partials, and it was nearly significant, and it was a moderate negative effect size. I guarantee you there would have been influencers with certain biases, or just people who know that controversial stuff gets a lot of clicks, who puts out a post saying, whoa, slow the roll. You thought lengthened partials were good. They're actually harmful. And we were right all along. Full range of motion is always the best. And for X, Y, and Z made up mechanistic reason, this is the case. I think there would be much more resistance today to this than there actually is currently. And it's a little more contentious, kind of leaning positive, not sure. And now, instead of imagining, I want you to probably accept the fact that I almost can 99% guarantee that that has happened multiple times already, because that is the world we're living in. There are some areas of research with high heterogeneity, and it is just due to chance alone likely that we would see one of these incorrectly, nearly significant, or maybe even significant negative findings when the overall effect size is positive, and that affected what journals were willing to publish, what got talked about, and there are probably some things that are going to reverse in the future. So instead of looking at this as, I hate science, it's always flip-flopping, it reverses itself, I can't trust it, I think if you know what to expect, and if you understand that what gets parroted online with this constant treadmill, and that content creators are actually looking for the controversial stuff, and sometimes journals are too, that we should actually anticipate that things with small positive effects are most of the time going to be null, and only in a small number of cases show positive findings, and there may even be the occasional negative. And that's actually par for the course, despite what we've kind of been calibrated to think about in terms of evaluating the evidence-based content as it comes out.
Yeah, I need to keep it short, but I do have many things I'd like to touch on there. First of all, I just want to reiterate something that I think you already made clear, but it's that the simulation exercise in your article showing that, hey, sometimes, most of the time these are null findings, and sometimes they might actually look like a pretty negative finding. The intention of that simulation, the take-home point is not that that can happen or could happen, it's that it should happen. And I think that's one of the things about sampling error that gets really misunderstood, is that we're not saying it's this like wacky, fluky thing that, I don't know, maybe once every 20 years will happen. Like, this is how things should go down. And that's one of the reasons where you hear a lot of people talking about why small sample research is not useless, but we have to be really cautious with it. A really good example of sampling error would be if you're flipping a coin, right? And let's say that you flip a coin 4 times and you get heads 3 times and tails only once. You don't freak out. You don't say, well, wait a minute, it should be 50-50. What's happening with this coin? It's some kind of fraudulent coin that's been weighted on one side. You'd say, yeah, that happens. So we all know intuitively that population level probabilities do not play out every time in tiny, tiny samples. We know this to be true. We know it for certain. Now, if you flip that coin 400 times and you get 300 heads, something is wrong with that coin, or there's a biased process by which it's being flipped and unveiled, okay? Yeah, so you are now in magic trick territory without question. So it's really important to understand like why sample size matters. And what you were alluding to is, I think people probably think it's annoying. I assume they think it's annoying because I think it's annoying and I'm the one doing it. But a lot of times in mass or on podcasts, when people talk about a contentious area of research, I usually say, let's give it 5 or 10 years and we'll kind of see how the dust settles. And I think a lot of people kind of spit out their coffee and say, five or 10 years, For what? I won't even care in 5 or 10 years. But the reality is like, I think it's really, this might not make sense to people who don't do research, but it's a lovely romantic notion that we're one great study away from the answer. Like as researchers who almost exclusively have severe ego problems and personality disorders, we all think that we are the ones who are going to create this perfect study that's going to unveil the real truth of how reality works. Reality works via sampling error. And we do know that even if you design it perfectly well, sometimes, especially if it's a relatively small sample, going to get wacky stuff. And what we don't need is the one perfect study. What we actually need is like 18 very good studies. And that's going to help us kind of see how this stuff all gets together. Now, of course, you don't need quite as many studies if you have very good methods, tight control, and large sample sizes. But open up an exercise journal and go to a random page. N is less than 100. N is probably less than 30 in whatever page you just flipped to, right? So that's just kind of a reality. And one of the things that I want to kind of reiterate is, Helms, you talked about how it's really common where there's some new area of research, and we're talking emerging stuff. The first few studies are coming out and people are following it closely. A lot of times we have the benefit that the first few studies are trickling into the literature and no one cares yet. But every now and then we'll get this kind of situation, and the first study is, show something positive, and then there's like maybe a null, then a positive, then 2 null, right? And it's kind of going back and forth. And a lot of folks have told me over the years, they're like, I'm really into, I actually don't want to frame it as a people told me kind of story. I have observed being interested in the creation of evidence-based fitness content going back, I don't know, what year is it, 2025? I mean, remember getting into this stuff 15 years ago. And I think that there was a really pervasive idea, even among like the really sharp people that make content in fitness, that it was like, I like physiology. That's what got me into fitness. I'm going to very intensely study physiology, and I refuse to understand statistics. It's not that I don't, it's that I won't. Like I don't need it because I understand the physiology well enough that I don't need all that statistics crap. And I think one of the things that's really unfortunate about that, among many, is that when you run into this situation where there's a few small studies trickling out, you have no tools to work with in terms of interpretation. You don't have the right tools. The tools you have are, first, you start fishing around for patterns that cannot possibly be elucidated, right? So there's 3 studies. One's in females, one's in males, and one's in a mixed sex sample. And you say, I guess this doesn't work in women, right? And it's like, well, you have no basis for establishing that pattern. Like, even if you wanted to, maybe you'll end up being right, but we can't even hope to identify that pattern. But one of your tools is to go into this sparse data and create these intricate images out of like constellations of stars, right? Where it's like, yeah, I mean, that I guess is a lion, but like it could also be a ladle, who knows, right? So that's one of the things that's an issue. But after you exhaust that, and you usually drive yourself nuts looking for patterns that don't exist, the next thing is calling bullshit. And you just say like, oh yeah, this research group finds positive findings because they're crooks. Or this research group finds negative findings because they're sloppy, or null findings because they're sloppy. Or this group finds negative findings because they hate the group that finds the positive findings. So like, it really puts you in a situation where you're looking for patterns that cannot possibly be elucidated, or you're just slinging mud. And so that's why I'm glad to see, especially within the last few years, a rising tide in evidence-based fitness where people are saying, we don't just get into stats for its own sake. We get into it because stats are kind of what makes this whole enterprise run. I think it's worth noting that if you show me a paper that dramatically changed how you view blank, meal timing, protein intake, lengthened partials, lengthened bias training, volume, frequency. Any paper that you want to send me as being one that you thought was impactful, there's a p-value in it. And there's not just a p-value in it. The conclusions are fully based on the p-values within that paper. So for me, as someone who enjoys statistics, it kind of breaks my heart every time someone says, well, I don't need to learn all that crap. I don't even need a superficial understanding of that crap. I'm just going to focus on the physiology. And then you say, well, show me a physiology paper that's meaningful to you. And 100% of the conclusions are based on statistics. So I think papers like this, or articles like this, discussions like this, they're not sexy. There's not a lot of clickbait that we can derive from this. But I think that they are fundamentally critical because it really helps shift that perspective from, when you start seeing these conflicting findings. We went through this with the citrulline literature many years ago, where it was like there are a few papers coming out, look kind of good, then kind of null, then, something in the middle.
Beta-alanine too.
And beta-alanine too, yeah. But, there are a lot of people who are kind of riding the ups and downs of like, oh, this worked 6 years ago, but now it sucks. And it's like, that doesn't really make sense. And so eventually, even after, I published a meta-analysis about citrulline. And even in the meta-analysis, I was like, you know what? There's not really enough studies for me to feel incredible about this conclusion. So I kind of framed in the meta-analysis, I did my best using my linguistic tools available to me to kind of reiterate, like, this is a tentative progress report on what citrulline's looking like. And the effect size was exactly the kind of thing we're talking about now, right? At 0.2. Seems like it's kind of a trivial positive thing. So anyway, I'm kind of going on and on, but like, I think it's really important to recognize that this story is going to repeat over and over again. So you might as well understand it now rather than later. When it comes to the sampling error stuff or sampling variance, they're synonymous. And I think rather than when we run into these situations like we did with citrulline, beta-alanine, now lengthened bias training, when you see what appears to be contradictory findings and you get that queasy feeling inside of like cognitive dissonance and like, well, wait a minute, things either work or they don't. Why would a thing simultaneously work and not work? It's really liberating and clarifying to understand not only can this happen, this absolutely ought to happen when we talk about small effects. And I think that is ultimately the real value of the work you put into that article is saying this isn't just a warning about something that could be out there. This is something that if you want to follow the exercise science literature, you better get really comfortable with it, because we don't see a lot of effect sizes above 0.2 or 0.3. Unless we're really going for the low hanging fruit. Does a 36-week endurance exercise program increase VO2 max? Turns out it does.
In untrained individuals who are sedentary
exactly,
previously,
yeah. In previously critically ill individuals who were on bed rest for 3 months. Like, unless you're looking at those kinds of effects of like, does exercise impact the body? Yes. But when you're talking about these little things of tweaking this, tweaking that, throwing a little powder or potion in the mix, yeah, you better get comfortable with the mixed findings. And, I do want to clarify, we also have to hesitate of attributing everything to like, well, okay, one positive study came out, then two null. We shouldn't file everything away as, well, clearly this is going to end up being a small effect, but in the positive, and it will be useful. So like, for example, we did see, we've seen things like with, what was that purported testosterone boost?
D-aspartic acid.
Yeah, D-aspartic acid.
We had three studies when one flipped negative, and I was like, let's hold the phone. Not 30 studies like we do in the area of like lengthened bias training.
Yeah, but it was one of those things. The first study came out and it was like, oh, beautiful. Apparently this is a really potent test booster, and we can all be natty and have testosterone coming out of our ears, and it'll be great. But that one really, after that first little glimmer of optimism, eventually it just kind of tanked and kind of fell off the map. But so we have to understand that like when we know the true effect is trivial to small, we are going to see some stuff on the positive and the negative. But just because we see one of those positives drop off, we shouldn't anchor ourselves as, oh, cool, then this will be like either kind of helpful or just like a non-effect, right? Like we shouldn't automatically say, okay, I'm going to anchor myself to the upper ends of this sampling error rather than the lower ends of the sampling error, because it's probably gonna flesh out in both directions.
Well said, Trex. And the only thing I would add is, unfortunately as well, we're people, and there are two aspects.
I hate
that we're the worst. We really are. There are two major aspects of that accepting this reality, we also have to accept that people with a bias are going to find patterns. You know, they're going to be doing astrology with this, right? They're going to look at that. You know, it's exactly like I thought, because I'm aware or focusing on, or I'm going to unequally apply my understanding of sampling variance to different studies, right? And on this one, I'm going to overinterpret on the methods. On this one, I'm good with it. On this one, I'm going to say it's just sampling variance, and this one I'm not. So you're going to have people, for the exact reasons that are accurate, misapply this to hold out hope or hold out criticism for a decade after the fact, you know, where we've got multiple published meta-regressions, and all we're seeing is a tightening of the confidence interval as these things come out over time with a similar effect size. So that's the way it is. And I think another really interesting psychological thing is that the exact people who are attracted to evidence-based topics are also the exact people in many cases who hate probabilistic thinking, because
they hate uncertainty so much.
Yes, 100% it. And statistics is math, but statistics is a branch of math where you do not get to have certainty. If you ask what is 2 plus 2, it is always 4, and it always will be 4. But if you ask what is the probability of observing a 0.2 effect size in a sample of a population, you don't get to see 0.2 every time, and you should expect not to. And I think that is a really tough thing to grasp. So you will have some really strong personalities who want science to be the 10 Commandments, who want it to give them the truth. And if they don't know stats, or if they know just enough to be dangerous, they can be extremely convincing. They can even know physiology really, really, really well, and they can amass a pretty large following, but they can be yelling from the tops of Mount Dunning or Kruger. They're right next to each other. And I guarantee you that some of the people who I will not name are people well established in our community who you are following, and that is a perfect representation of them, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think, you know, one funny thing, a little bit of inside baseball, as someone who really, for whatever reason, I didn't go into grad school planning to enjoy statistics, but it just kind of caught me. And one of the things that I think drew me to it was this kind of this coy game that statistics plays on you as you're learning it, where it's like, even when you're just learning, like, what is the right way to analyze this data? I mean, you start asking at, like, you know, once you get beyond like undergrad level stats and you start getting into like doctoral level stats, you know, you'll say, what's the right way to do this? And, you know, your professor is basically like one of these, like, a stat professor, if they're doing their job right, they basically speak in riddles. They're like an old wizard who refuses to give any kind of straightforward answer to any question.
There are many winding paths up to the Mount Mordor, but which one will get you there safest? And you're like, so Bayesian is a no-go on this study? Yeah.
So like, yeah, so they'll say like, well, there are many ways. And then you just like get into this back and forth where every time you get an answer, you're like, that's either a riddle or you are telling me I'm asking the wrong question or something. But yeah, it's really funny that I got into it thinking stats were like, here's this flow chart and it gets you to the truth. But even in the process of like figuring out what's the right way to do stats, you find like a lot of it is, well, that's a pretty philosophical question that you're asking. And it's always so slippery. And you really do have to just kind of steep in it for a long time and develop your own compass of like, where do I fall on these different spectra of, on any statistical decision? essentially like liberal to conservative, as it goes statistically speaking. But I remember probably the funniest thing that I can remember kind of explaining one of these via anecdote is I was really going down a rabbit hole about post hoc tests. So after you have like an ANOVA that is comparing, let's say, 4 groups, and it says, well, there's something significant in here. Some of these groups are different from others. Then you have to go follow up with tests to say, well, which ones and in what manner? And you need to do some adjustments to make sure that you're not just running a zillion tests, which inflates your error rate on any given test. And certainly your cumulative error rate is more correct. But I remember my professor, who was like this brilliant guy who was like 80 years old. He had been threatening to retire for like 15 years, but he kept showing up. And he was brilliant. And he basically said like a thing that caught my ear so wrong. And I was like, I've been using that post hoc test for a long time, and I've never heard that in my life. Like it's not that I don't believe you. It's just, I want to see how this works in the literature. So I'm diving through the literature. I can't find anything peer reviewed. I'm all over the forums for stats. I can't find anything. Searching and searching far and wide. This was many years ago, before large language models would have maybe taken me right to it or lied to me just to make me feel better. And so eventually I find in like the deepest, darkest internet forum for statistical sickos, just absolute degenerates. And I finally found the source of someone else saying that this thing is true. And after this long back and forth of like professional statisticians arguing about it, they all reached an agreement. Okay, this is valid. And the original source was because Bill Ware said so. And that was my professor. And I was like, you have got to be kidding me. So basically, there's a dark room where all the statisticians are getting together and figuring this stuff out. And then they just share riddles with each other and hope no one ever finds the actual source. But all that is to say, like, if you don't like uncertainty, like you said, Helms, statistics is not for you. But unfortunately, like, that's kind of the engine that makes this whole thing go, or at least helps us turn, data sheets into conclusions in the context of an exercise science research. So, exercise science study. So, yeah, man, it's slippery stuff. It's annoying. It requires so much patience. And yeah, I hate being the person who says it all the time. But when someone says, who can reconcile this for me? And it's like, well, it's not who, it's when. And it's not in 6 months when the next study comes out. It's in 6 years when the next 13 studies come out.
Holy Bonferroni, my friend. And I get it why many of the non-necessarily researcher, but highly intelligent, evidence-based folks out there have typical personalities and lean into biomechanics and physiology, because they are essentially the math of human movement and ultimately, whenever it comes down to it, the math of the way things change biochemically in the body. And why you will hear some people say, you know what, give me a mechanism over a, comparative trial any day, because humans, you can't control the environment. All this stuff, like, you're over relying on stats. And ultimately what they're really saying is, I, at the core level of my personality, hate uncertainty, like clear answers. And if you give me the opportunity to have clear answers and post hoc rationalize my way to holding a paradigm of operating in the world, I can just say, I don't care what that study says because ATP does this. Or I don't care what that study says because this is the way motor unit recruitment operates. Or I don't care what that study says because I would rather rely on things that don't have sampling error. And they'll be extremely, extremely specific on things that they know about. They will give you highly detailed answers. They won't just say it depends. They can tell you what it depends on when they're talking about the biomechanics or the physiology that they're well versed in. But when you ask them why the meta-regression is not valid, they'll just they'll take 100 million steps back and make a high-level generalization that someone with just a little bit of stats knowledge could go, that's not accurate, but it sounds smart. because it's sufficient for them to have convinced themselves that they want to live in this world where they don't need to actually understand probabilistic thinking. And it's all just bullshit and over-reliance on stats. So I'm not saying you shouldn't know physiology or biomechanics. I think you really should. I think you can over-rely purely on empirical findings because there needs to be a physiological or biomechanical rationale for the way things work that comports with the things that are well established. And unfortunately for the folks who like mechanisms over empirical studies, if you go all the way back to the mechanisms, which they are heavily reliant on that are well established, I hate to tell you this, but we actually established those mechanisms through empirical research. But don't tell them that. That's really going to mess up their worldview. So anyway.
No, it all started when I was born. Everything before that is mechanisms. And now all this newfangled stuff is empiricist garbage. I do find it, I'm going to be slightly snarky here, but I do find it a little bit ironic, if not comical, that there are a lot of folks who are kind of like the old school types in fitness. And if you were to talk to them about anything related to training, and you said like, you know what, I know that training or nutrition, I know that this strategy would probably be good for my development and help bring me to the next level, but I don't really like it. And I much prefer this thing over here. So I'm going to do this thing over here instead. They would be hypercritical of you and say, this isn't about doing what's fun. It's about doing what's correct. Like, you have to do the hard things, not just the things you like. That's how you get better. Suck it up and do the hard part because it's good for you. And they will beat their chest spouting off all these mechanisms for whatever field of study they enjoy engaging with. But then when you tell them, like, you would be a lot better at this if you took some time to humble yourself and learn some statistics. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep doing the stuff I like. So like, I don't know, as someone who's a little bit primed to be on the snarky, if not cynical side, I do find it funny that like you can observe people whose content does not at all match their actions when it comes to like, what do you need to be better at the things that you're currently doing, and how harsh on you or how harsh are you on people who refuse to do the hard stuff that would benefit them? And there's just like this huge discrepancy that I find comical. I get a chuckle out of it.
It's called getting old, Trex. You just tell other people what they need to do, and then you are totally unwilling to change. And I say that as someone who's old,
that is true. We have the proof for that.
I feel it creeping in, and I rail against it with every fiber of my being. Every time I'm like, oh God, ain't nobody got time for that. And I was like, I look in the mirror and I go, who are you? I ain't got time for that. You spend like 30 hours a week training to get gains that may not even come. You need to not get old. And I make myself not be that which I hate.
Yeah, it is weird though, because like, I mentioned Bill Ware earlier, who was one of my stats professors who was just incredible. And this man was like 80 and he was on the cutting edge of using R for statistics. And I just remember I was talking to someone else who was a professor who was like 33 and they were like, I was like, dude, you got to switch over to R. You got to stop using this SPS crap as your software. It's just like, if you just try this, you will understand why I'm so adamant about this. And they're like, dude, I've already like done all my training. I'm old now. I couldn't possibly switch. Yeah. And it's like, okay, so the 80-year-old made the jump, but the 33-year-old is too old. So it is a getting old thing. But whenever I feel that kind of old man resistance to learning new things or changing my ways, I always remember Bill Ware, and I'm like, come on, man, like you can do this. So we should all aspire to maintain that youthful element, that essence of saying, I believe that my best days are ahead of me, and it makes sense to invest in myself and to learn new things and to conquer new challenges and to use better statistical softwares.
Or just become friends with Eric Trexler and James Steele and learn it on a conceptual level. But if you actually had to open R, you would be like, oh my God. And well, actually, to be honest, I remember I talked to you about this, Trex, and you and also my good friend, Dr. Matt Cross, who's a statistical advisor for our school, discouraged me from going down the rabbit hole of learning R because of other things that I need to do, but encouraged me to still maintain an increasing knowledge of the conceptual applications of stats generally. But man, with ChatGPT assisted R, it seems like it's so much easier to learn now.
Oh yeah. So here's the thing. Now you're gonna get me going on a tangent that no one cares about.
No. Chin Hua Chong just asked, this is Dr. Trexler's online nemesis. I would like to know if Dr. Helms likes to use R, SAS, SPSS, or MATLAB for his statistical software. Dr. Helms likes to ask Dr. Trexler or some of his other colleagues to use R, is the answer to that.
Yeah. So here's the thing about ChatGPT and other large language models for statistical analysis. They are, this is tough. Do they make it easier? Yes. But they also, that is both a good thing and a very dangerous thing.
Okay.
So one of the reasons that people, Bill Ware, the smartass, he would always say when people criticized R, he would smugly look at them and say, oh, I totally understand you don't like it. R is only for people who know what they're doing. And he would literally say that to people's face in academic settings. But the thing about it is the reason people like it so much is because it has infinite flexibility. Infinite. And so what that means is you can now with large language models know just enough to be dangerous with it. Whereas a lot of other statistical softwares previously had been so limited that it was basically like riding a train down the tracks. And it's like, yeah, you could pull the switch and go left or right, but like you're not going off-roading through the mud, And so there are some instances where if I want to take a little shortcut and get just the gist of it down, I'll hop in a large language model, say, hey, here's kind of my variable names. Here's what I'm trying to put together. And it can help me with some of the more just like straight up coding. Instead of hard coding everything, it'll write me some functions and loops and things like that. But then when you get down to it, I'll be like, hey, dude, what you did right here is terrible statistical practice. And like, clearly someone wrote this on a blog somewhere as what they do. And that's where you're grabbing this from. But that is bad statistical practice and would lead me somewhere between an insufficient answer to just a wrong answer because you didn't really tweak all these tweakable things correctly. So I would say it's good to supplement your learning with these large language models.
Code. Like it'll find errors. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's good to kind of supplement your learning with that. But it is not yet a replacement for getting your hands dirty, diving into that code after it's generated and making sure that everything's tightened up the way it needs to be.
Yeah, and to be clear, I was more so saying that from the perspective of someone who is intimidated by the process of coding itself, rather than someone who's going, well, I don't need to learn the statistical concepts that are underlying.
No.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is you actually do need to, like if I didn't know any R coding, like how the language and architecture works, I would not be able to edit the large language model outputs in a way that would actually be accurate and sufficient for my needs. So I'm not saying like
you
learning
know
these
that you're wrong because you wouldn't know to tell them the code that it did something different than you thought it did.
Yeah. So basically, what you would do is you would get caught in this loop where R kicks back an error and you tell it to ChatGPT and then they change it and you get like a new error and you go back and forth, or they just get you something that doesn't catch any errors or doesn't, create any errors, but ultimately is not the right way to get at your question. There's some tweaks that need to be made. And I can't imagine how I would make those if I didn't know the coding language. And more importantly, the actual architecture of what's happening behind the screen. So all of that is to say, like, if you're someone who's got the jitters about kind of opening it up and typing the first few letters into that big open scary box, absolutely the large language models get you past that first hurdle, but it's still definitely worthwhile to sink your teeth into learning the language and the architecture so that you can actually modify those outputs. And if nothing else, like I can't, maybe this is my personality type, but if I actually like just did a few like natural language prompts, got code for analysis, and then published a paper with it, I would live in a state of terror of just from not understanding what was happening in that code. You know what I mean? So yeah. I think it's one of those things you got to learn alongside it, but it is a tremendous learning aid for sure.
Yeah. And to be a less facetious answer to Xinhua Chong, the only software I have used as someone who has occasionally done the stats for his own papers has been JASP and SPSS. And
JASP is fantastic, by the way.
It's great. It's like the better UI open source version of SPSS. And then back before it was denigrated online, I also was pretty good with the spreadsheets for MBI. Hopkins,
there you go, man.
Hopkins World. So yeah.
Someone said, what about Python? Python's great. I think it's more of a field specific thing. I guarantee if I came up in the engineering world or the mathematics world, I'd probably be doing a lot more in Python and or MATLAB. So yeah, Python's cool. A lot of people argue. Here's something that's relevant, Helms. Sports science. Are you familiar?
I think so. Sport and exercise science, is that in the same realm?
Yeah, kind of. I'm talking about the sports science industry.
Oh, yeah, like being a sports scientist for a team.
Yeah, so it's an emerging industry that honestly is kind of odd because like I also have degrees that say sports science on them. We did zero of what would actually prepare you to be a professional sports scientist. Not knocking my programs, it's just like this thing just kind of popped up quickly. But basically,
so it has been. This is a really interesting distinction because I've heard it's so strange to me that America just kind of came into this so late. But
yeah, big time.
Cottage industry, and you get a sports science degree in England, anywhere in the UK, to be honest, Ireland, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Like my job did prepare me to be a sports scientist,
Oh, see that
yeah.
The stuff
my degree did prepare me to be a sports scientist. I didn't lean into that portion of it at all. But
yeah. So I've been doing a little sports science stuff here at Duke. And fortunately, I am a disgusting person who's really into stats and coding, so I felt pretty okay with it. But at least in the American circles, who are the folks who are doing sports science, it is basically you're basically a data scientist more than anything. So a lot of it is kind of like low level software engineering almost. You have to be very good at coding across multiple languages, very, very tech savvy. So it's kind of like data scientist / visualization expert / low key software engineer gets plopped into a sports team and they say, hey, we're going to give you massive amounts of data from all sorts of technologies. You have to integrate it in a meaningful, cohesive way and build us dashboards so that our coaches can look at a thing and say, green is good. So, kind of simplified visualizations. This is going down. We want it to go up. We need to do something about that,
Yeah. High Performance Sport New Zealand, back when I first started my program at AUT, they're in the same building. Most of the alumni of our sports science programs end up working or I should say the other way around. Most of these strength conditioning and sports science members of High Performance Sport New Zealand are AUT alumni. They had a system set up when they were focusing on velocity specific training, not velocity based training, but they were either training force or velocity based upon a perceived deficit in a athlete. It was all color coded, like green light, so they had force plates and LPTs embedded into each one of their squat racks, and the conditioner as well as the athlete, they were trying to get the needle to pop up in the green, or at least the yellow.
Yeah.
Oh, depending on the phase, or we're in a force dominant phase. Okay, put more weight on the bar. Let's get in the green. And I'm kind of looking, that would just be lifting more weight, but okay, cool. We definitely need this $1 million squat rack. But anyway, yeah.
No, and I should acknowledge, I kind of painted with a broad brush in a general sense. I will say I've been very impressed, at least with every coach that I've personally interacted with has been super enthusiastic and very knowledgeable. So like, I do think it kind of depends on the sport, the culture, the area that you're in. in terms of how much people embrace some of the complexities of sports science. I've been really impressed with every person that I've interacted with in the space, but I have heard horror stories of elsewhere where people make these like really insightful observations, these beautiful dashboards, and they go kind of underappreciated. But fortunately, that's not been my experience at all. But anyway, the reason I brought it up is in the sports science world, you get a lot of folks who are really torn. Do I go the R path or do I go the Python path? Relevant to the question in the chat. And people go both ways and have a great deal of success. So it really doesn't matter. But you will find, honestly, if you're young enough and you have the appetite for it, being at least decent in both is probably a good move if you want to get into sports science, because you will get plopped into a Major League Baseball program where they say, we all do R, period. Or you get plopped into a program where they say, we all do Python, period. And it's literally a deal breaker if you say, well, what if everyone changes to accommodate my linguistic preferences? It's like, yeah, we'll just find somebody else. So yeah, if you want to go into that world, definitely you want to get into that stuff. But Helms, I think we've pushed our dear audience as far as we possibly can in terms of the minutia.
We have to do some actual like rapid fire fitness related question answering. My proposal is that we each take 2 from the individual chats that we feel we can answer in under 5 minutes. I do 2, you do 2, we close it down. What do you say?
Yeah, that sounds good. Do you have any picked out on your end?
I do.
Okay, so you're going to do the iron culture ones. I'll do the mass ones.
Yeah, if you're good with that.
Yep.
Okay, first one is Kim Culver asks, I've heard the caloric cost of lifting being approximated by physical work, but this would calculate a negative energy expenditure for eccentric contractions. Surely our muscles use some positive amount of ATP during eccentric contractions. Do we know how this compares to concentric exercise? So Kim, I think you are being just a little too literal in your interpretation of what you've heard of this. So work is actually calculated by, mass, displacement, and you can figure out, work over time, right? But when people say work, a lot of the times it's shorthand for volume load. So they're literally just calculating the concentric reps times sets times load. And then that does scale linearly with total energy expenditure, but it is not directly proportionate, if I recall correctly from the research I've looked at. And also when people call eccentrics negatives, or when you're thinking about positive or negative work, that's not the same thing. So you actually do absolutely use ATP when you're performing an eccentric contraction. I should say an eccentric action, because it's not really contracting, but it is less. Eccentric actions are much more energy efficient than concentric. But no, it is not a perpetual motion energy creation magic machine to do an eccentric where you're actually reducing the amount of calorie expenditure. So 2 things just to clarify. When people say work, most of the time it's a proxy for volume load. And then when people say that caloric cost in physical work are roughly the same, they're talking about the volume load calculation having the same rough directionality and magnitude as energy expenditure. And then finally, yes, we do expend ATP to do eccentric contractions, but it's substantially less than concentric. You want to tackle one?
Yeah, I can do that. Got a question from Noah. Would there be any upsides or downsides to wearing a weighted vest throughout the day while averaging 7,000 to 10,000 steps? There would be both. So on the upsides, if this is important to you, you will probably note an increase in your physical activity energy expenditure. When it comes to downsides, you will be wearing a weighted vest throughout the day. So that will be generally not an enjoyable sensation of just feeling a heavy load on your body throughout the entire day. You will have to answer the question a million times throughout the day. What are you doing and why are you covered in weights? A lot of folks who try to do this, and Helms, I think you're one of them, found it to be a fairly cumbersome and not super enjoyable process. Like sometimes it's framed as like, yeah, you just go about your day and you just wear this thing and like it's just free, all upsides. But it's generally like not a very comfortable thing to do, and it's very cumbersome. But another upside I should mention, there's thought. There's an emerging theory that still requires, I think, a lot of science to kind of really drill down what's going on. but there's an emerging theory that there is some kind of gravitostat, some kind of sensor that detects our body weight, potentially in our bones, and that perhaps you can kind of fool this sensor into believing that your body weighs more than it actually does. And the idea, one of the most common applications I've seen is people who say, well, what if I lose some weight, but I replace that with a weighted vest, and then my body maybe won't perceive that our body weight has gone down. Maybe we won't get some of those crummy side effects that we notice during, extended fat loss periods, low energy availability, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a long way to go to actually flesh out that science. And so for me, I've never gone this route. And based on the mixed anecdotes I've heard, I don't think I would plan to until I saw something that was a lot more compelling in the human literature. All right, Helms, kicking it back to you.
Okay, cool. Here's one. Do protein recommendations, and this is from Tijman Mulder, do protein recommendations stay the same for people who only train parts of their body, e.g. never train lower body, or would recommended range be lower? There's actually some acute protein synthesis research data on this that gives us some hint, where, if I recall correctly, you were able to benefit, at least in the short term, in terms of getting higher total rates of myofibular muscle protein synthesis when doing a full body workout, if you were to compare that to other studies on just doing, say, leg extensions or an upper body session, which does hint at the idea that the total amount of muscle mass that is trying to be grown, which really makes sense, is probably going to respond to the amount of, or indicate the amount of protein that you would benefit from, because there's more sources where you're going to be doing things with amino acids, right? I think in terms of practice, I think conceptually the way to think about this is that protein would probably scale to the amount of protein that you need to use. And there's so many things that impact that. Like, there's actually data showing that endurance athletes need a higher protein intake to not be in a nitrogen balance deficit. And nitrogen balance is a really, really broad sweeping brushstroke type of method, which just looks at all total nitrogen losses in the body. And importantly, nitrogen is only in protein or protein containing compounds. So you won't get that from in fat or carbohydrate. And it's really just a tool that's used in population level studies to indicate the amount of protein needed to probably prevent malnutrition. So more active, you need more protein. Generating muscle protein synthesis to hopefully induce hypertrophy in more locations, you're going to need more protein. Causing muscle damage, which is probably one of the reasons why endurance athletes have higher requirements and a lot of different muscles, you would probably be able to use more protein. Frankly, if you're a beginner, I would even anticipate if you're growing faster for whatever reason, you might be able to benefit from more protein. And people have speculated for the same reason that people using anabolic steroids could use more protein. But these are relatively small differences in the grand scheme of things. And I don't think we have the fidelity to be able to give a specific protein recommendation if you're just, the dude who only does bench press. But I think best chance is just be within the reasonable range for protein and probably be making sure you get your best bang for the buck.
See, you just committed a sin that I learned about in college. I was in an undergrad class about debating, and it was interesting. It was back in a day where I think it was less explosive to kind of let kids go at it in the college classroom and really have at it, exchanging ideas, trying to best each other intellectually. But one time one time in one of these intellectual spars, I used the term reasonable. Surely any reasonable person would blank. And he was like, "Ooh, you don't want to go down that road. You've made a mistake here." So shame on you, Helms. You used reasonable. So
it wasn't very reasonable for me to do that. I apologize.
Yeah. Because obviously I was implying the other person was an unreasonable human being, and that was given the subject matter a bit too far. All right, we got a question here. Is sprint cycling a good way to train for quad hypertrophy? And do you have any ideas on how to program it? I have a road bike and a velodrome near my house. Do you know what a velodrome is?
Yeah, I think it is a stationary sprint cycle, isn't it? Is it not? I'll look it up.
I don't know. But anyway, Sprint cycling, is it a good way to train for quad hypertrophy? I would say yes, with a big caveat and asterisk. So whether or not something's good for hypertrophy, a huge factor is going to be what your baseline is. So you can absolutely find high quality. What is it?
It's the actual indoor track that people do
That's
sprint
what I was thinking,
on.
because they said it was near their house. And I was like, well, having a stationary bike near your house is an odd thing to say.
I was thinking Pelotron. Just ignore me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I will.
That's why I'm embarrassed.
Yeah. So anyway, a lot of it has to do with where you're starting. So that you'll find really good research papers where people do a walking program and they induce leg hypertrophy, because they were in a really low state of fitness before the intervention. Then you'll find, studies that scale it up in a little bit and they say, well, guess what? We're going to do BFR walking. And then people who were in not quite as bad a shape at baseline still induce hypertrophy via that walking. And then you'll find studies that, well, guess what? Now we're going to do stair walking. And, some people will grow from that too. So it really comes down to where you're starting and where you're trying to get. And sprint cycling definitely falls within that paradigm between walking and on flat ground and the most optimal lower body resistance training program you could possibly design for hypertrophy. So it definitely falls in the middle there. So would I expect a lot of hypertrophy if Helms, who are the top IFBB pros these days? Give me a couple names. Nick Walker's up there, right?
Yep. Nick Walker. You could take Chris Bumstead, just retired, but he's up there.
Yeah.
Actually plays second in open division. Sure.
So if we have Nick Walker and we put him in a sprint cycling program, I do not think we're going to untap new hypertrophy, especially if it's replacing his lower body training, right? So all of that is to say, I think a good percentage of the population would actually experience some quad hypertrophy from a dedicated sprint cycling program. But the question is, how trained are you? And, basically, what are we replacing when we make room for this sprint cycling? If we're taking out more traditional hypertrophy-focused resistance training and putting this instead, I would say that's probably not a good trade if the goal is hypertrophy. In terms of how I would program it, generally speaking, I would focus on very high-intensity work. If there's a way, I'm not a bike guy, so I don't know much about it, but the bikes I have, the exercise-oriented stationary bikes I've used in the past have had ways to increase the resistance. And I assume, you can probably change some gears maybe to make the cranking a little harder on a bike. But basically, I would go for as much resistance as I could generate, and I would go for short bursts, anywhere from maybe 30 seconds to a minute at a time, taking, after these intense intervals, taking a couple minutes to rest with some active recovery in between, maybe do anywhere from 10 to 15 really intense sprints during a session, perhaps working up eventually into some higher volumes. And I'd maybe do that 3 or 4 times a week. That's probably how I put it together. I don't feel great about that. I wouldn't say like this is the Trexler method sprint cycling hypertrophy program, but that's kind of the basics just in terms of balancing. We want to get a good stimulus from it. But I tell you what, man, in terms of paying the cost of admission and really paying your dues for hypertrophy, sprint cycling is going to be a nasty way to do it, man. It's brutal. And so you really have to factor in, how in the world am I going to recover from this really nasty stuff? Because if you're sprinting for hypertrophy, it's going to be brutal.
And just one thing I want to add to address the potential question that led to this question. There are amazing pictures of sprint cyclists who have redonkulous quads. In every single one of those examples, those guys also train legs. Just please be aware of that.
They squat like a truck.
Yes.
Yeah. I used a picture of one of them in the class that I'm teaching this semester, and I made that exact case. I was kind of talking about specificity of training. Are you able to hear me? You look like you're okay. But so I was talking about specificity of training, and as part of this lecture, I had a picture of the really famous German guy whose quad. He looks like he could go toe to toe with an IFBB pro in terms of quad mass and shape. And I was like, believe me, this helps for his cycling, but those quads are not from cycling. This guy is probably squatting 4 days a week, bending bars, Tom Platt style. So yeah, it's very important to address that. So good call, Helms.
No worries, man.
All right, man. I think we're done for the day, right? We're wrapping it up.
Let's close it down. There are some other questions, but I think those were the most pertinent ones that were practical and wouldn't take forever.
Yes. All right. Well, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it as always. This is one of those episodes where we got a little, we really dove into the topic here. Didn't have quite as much time for questions, but we always appreciate the questions. We try to answer as many as we possibly can. So thank you so much for dropping those in the YouTube live chat. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe, review, share, send to a friend, all that stuff. Generally good ratings are preferred. If you're going to leave a bad rating, I'd consider maybe just forgetting about it. Do something else. Go for a walk in the park. Find a way to enjoy your time that doesn't involve hurting Helms and his economic prospects.
Yes. And also, now, if you want to see us live in the future, is there an opportunity for that, Trex?
Absolutely. I almost forgot, even though you reminded me right before we recorded. The whole mass crew, Trexler, Helms, Zordos, Colenso, Semple, we are all going to be presenting at the Sports Nutrition Association Conference in Austin, Texas, April 12th and 13th, I believe. And boy, are we looking forward to it. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. Austin, Texas is a beautiful city. If you've never been, make the trip out, catch the whole mass crew. And by the way, an incredible lineup of other speakers. We could go on and on. Helms, do you want to name drop a few of the legends that'll be joining us?
Lauren Conlon. We got Dr. Joe Klemczewski. We've got Gabriel Fundero. These are all folks who've been on Iron Culture as well. We've got more than that. We got Cliff Harvey. Danny Lennon. Yep. You just got to watch your back, but then you can get all the benefits and none of the death if you do that. And more. Sean Arendt. There's a bunch of great presenters. And it's going to be an awesome time.
Awesome. Helms, can I trouble you to put your headphone back in so the reverb doesn't pop into your microphone? Appreciate it. So it's going to be an incredible conference, an incredible event. We're going to have so much fun with it. Also, Jeremy Etier, I don't know if you mentioned him. He will be doing the keynote presentation. That's going to be fantastic. So yeah, come out, have a good time, barbecue, Mexican food, all that stuff.
It's a great conference too, because we get to interact with the participants. It's typically a pretty low ratio of participants to number of speakers. So there's a lot of opportunities for Q&A, chatting between talks. It's a great way to mix and mingle and network.
Intimate.
Yes.
That's the term. Intimate. So if you want to get to chat with the mass crew in a non-YouTube setting, that's the way to do it. And then, of course, if you love what we're doing here and you want to support, the best way to do that is by going over to massresearchreview.com and becoming a member of the mass community, and you'll get Helms's beautiful article all about lengthened biased training and sampling variants and everything in between. That'll be coming out the first of the month. So everyone, thank you so much. We will be back in a week with another episode. Everyone take care of yourself, and see you in 7 days.